John Chrysostom, the man with the golden mouth, is without doubt one of the brightest stars in the galaxy of the early church. He deserves to be much better known. And perhaps he was better known to a past generation. Certainly he has been one of the early church fathers, most admired by our Protestant ancestors in the faith. And if we ask why our spiritual predecessors thought so highly of him, it's partly because Chrysostom was a great biblical preacher. And biblical preaching has, of course, always been dear to Protestants. Partly it's because of the heroic quality of Chrysostom's life. He was clearly a man of lofty and unbending moral and spiritual principle, who defied powerful opponents and ultimately paid the price, a martyr for Christ. Let me offer an example of the high regard our Protestant forefathers had for Chrysostom, and I direct you to a great preacher of more recent times, C.H. Spurgeon. Spurgeon quotes Chrysostom almost incessantly. In looking forward to being in heaven, Spurgeon tells us that one of its greatest joys will be to meet Chrysostom. I do not doubt but that you will know Isaiah in heaven, and you will recognize the great preachers of the ancient Christian church. You will be able to speak with Chrysostom, and will talk with Whitefield. Isaiah, Chrysostom, and George Whitefield, noble company for the glorified believer, according to Spurgeon. Spurgeon also said this: the old truth that Calvin preached, that Chrysostom preached, that Paul preached, is the truth that I must preach today, or else be a liar to my conscience and my God. Calvin, Chrysostom, and Paul, another excellent trio set before us by Spurgeon. And it's striking that in those two Spurgeonic trios, the great preachers and the great witnesses to the gospel, Chrysostom is the only one who appears in both. So let's cast our minds and imaginations back then, some 1,700 years, to the ancient city of Antioch in Syria in the days of the Roman Empire. Here John Chrysostom was born, probably in the year 349 or thereabouts. At that time, Antioch was one of the most important cities in the eastern half of the empire. It was the capital of the Roman province of Syria, and it had a population of between 150 and 300,000. Huge in those days. And it was increasingly a stronghold of the Christian faith. Although the upper classes were still largely pagan, and there was a powerful Jewish community in the city, the greater part of the ordinary people had embraced Christianity. Antioch was one of the most important historic centres of Christianity in the empire. The Christians of Antioch remembered with gratification that Peter and Paul had both ministered in the city, and that it was in Antioch that believers were first called Christians. That's Acts 11:26. The bishop of the mother church in Antioch was regarded as a sort of father bishop to the entire region of Syria. He had no official authority over the other bishops or congregations, but he was looked up to with a distinctive affection and respect. John's parents were not fabulously rich, but seem to have been very comfortable in their circumstances. His father, Secundus, was a high-ranking civil servant, but Secundus died shortly after John's birth. His mother, Anthusa, only 20 years old, decided never to remarry. She devoted herself to bringing up her young son, in whose face, we're told, she could discern the beloved features of her late husband. Not that John was an only child. He had an elder sister, but we know nothing of her life, and she was to play no part in John's. She may have died young. Incidentally, Chrysostom was not the family name of Secundus and Anthusa. It was a much later nickname given to John after his death, when he'd become universally recognized as one of the mightiest preachers with whom God had blessed the church. Chrysostom is Greek for golden mouth, a reference to John's eloquence in the pulpit. Now, it's uncertain whether Secundus was a Christian, but Anthusa emphatically was. And so John received an upbringing saturated in Christian influences. He was, we may say, raised Christian, in no uncertain terms, by a very devout mother. In one respect, however, John had a pagan education. He was put through the traditional Roman school system in Antioch, which was still dominated by pagan teachers, and its time-honoured pagan curriculum, logic, arithmetic, rhetoric, the classics of pagan literature. It seems to have done John no harm. His greatest pagan teacher was a celebrated professor named Libanius, who specialised in rhetoric, the art of communication by the spoken word. So perhaps paradoxically, John, the Christian preacher, learned the art of public speaking from the pagan Libanius. John's left us the following reminiscence of his tutor. When I was still a young man, I recall the admiration which my professor, incidentally the most superstitious of men, publicly expressed for my mother. In his usual way, he questioned the bystanders about my origins, and when he learned that I was the son of a widow, he inquired of me both my mother's age and the length of her widowhood. When I replied that she was 40 years old, and it was 20 years since she had lost my father, he was astounded, and looking round at the company exclaimed, "Great heavens, what remarkable women are to be found among the Christians." Libanius had the highest regard for John personally. When Libanius lay dying, his friends asked him who should take his place in Antioch as the professor of rhetoric, and Libanius replied, "It ought to have been John, had not the Christians stolen him from us." Now, immediately after he finished his school studies under Libanius, John underwent a radical change of attitude to his life and future. Reacting now against the prevailing paganism and secularism of his education, he became passionately devoted to studying the scriptures. And we might call this his conversion, in the sense that it was now that John became genuinely and personally committed to the faith he'd imbibed from childhood. At the same time, John also became a devotee of Meletius the Confessor, spiritual leader to the Orthodox Christian community in Antioch. At this juncture in early church history, the Arian controversy was still raging. The Arians denied the deity of Christ. Athanasius of Alexandria was their chief opponent. Now, the official church of Antioch had been taken over by the Arians, and so the Orthodox Christians withdrew and used to meet for worship in the open air, in different places, a mountain slope, a riverbank, a military exercise ground. Meletius was the bishop of this Orthodox community, and to him John now attached himself warmly. F.W. Farrer, in his Life of Chrysostom, says this of Meletius: "He was a man so dearly loved that, as Chrysostom mentions in a homily to his memory, men gave his name to their children, painted his portrait on their walls, and engraved it on their signet rings." At Easter, in the year 368, John was baptized by Meletius. And we see in John's case there what was in fact the normal pattern of the 4th century church, believer's baptism. John was raised a Christian, but not baptized until he was 19 years old, as an act of personal dedication to the faith his mother Anthusa had taught him. And we find that same pattern in the lives of other great fathers of that time: Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, Jerome, Augustine of Hippo, all raised Christian, but baptized only in maturity. As part of this new personal commitment to a Christian way of life, John now studied under the great Bible interpreter Diodor of Tarsus. Diodor was the assistant to Meletius in the Orthodox Christian community of Antioch. And one of Diodor's tasks was to give instruction to those who wanted to live a more serious and strenuous Christian life. John and others, who placed themselves under Diodor's instruction, made a personal covenant with Christ, in which they agreed to renounce marriage and various other interests which were seen as a hindrance to the highest Christian devotion. For example, they would abstain from eating meat and drinking wine. This manner of life was known as the ascetic life, from a Greek word that means one who is in training. We're told that in John's case, it also involved him in imposing long periods of absolute and strict silence on his tongue, in order to try to cure himself of the bad habit of criticizing other people behind their backs. Now, Diodor was very important in shaping John's approach to the exposition of Scripture. Two schools of thought dominated the church at that time. On the one hand, there were those who favoured an allegorical interpretation of Scripture. They tended to sit somewhat light to its obvious historical meaning and to search for deeper symbolic meanings. These interpreters were especially linked with the church in Alexandria, and so their method is often called the Alexandrian method of Bible interpretation. Diodor, however, emphasized the other school of thought, the straightforward historical meaning of the text, and he was in fact quite scathing about those who departed from this in search of supposedly deep symbolic meanings. John very much drank in Diodor's teaching on this matter, and when he became a preacher, he would always follow Diodor's method, sticking close to the text of Scripture and its obvious sense through a meticulous scholarly study of the meaning of words and historical backgrounds. Now, this method of interpretation was especially linked with John's home city of Antioch, and so it's called the Antiochene method. John's commitment to this method is another reason why Protestants have valued his writings. They found in John a kindred spirit as a careful, sober, scholarly student of the biblical text. In 371, John was ordained to what was then the lowest office in the Eastern Church, the office of reader, which was in terms of importance just below that of deacon. As a reader, John's responsibility was to read out the Old Testament passage and also the passage from one of the New Testament letters during the service of Holy Communion. This was still in the Orthodox community of Antioch that was meeting in the open air, led by Meletius. Indeed, John's elevation to the rank of reader was probably Meletius's way of strengthening the leadership in his community prior to his own departure from Antioch into exile. This exile was brought about by the Eastern emperor Valens, who was an Arian, and had decided to make Antioch his place of residence. Meletius therefore departed to his native Armenia to escape oppressive Arian laws against Orthodox bishops who believed in the deity of Christ. But Meletius left the Orthodox community in very good hands, such as those of young John. Meletius' departure, however, seems to have precipitated a personal crisis in John's life. He and his close friend Basil heard that the Orthodox in Antioch were planning to seize the two young men and force them to become bishops. That may sound odd, but it was in fact a normal part of church life in the 4th century. Very often, congregations would almost violently press gang into becoming bishops those men whom they judged suitable. That was how the great Augustine was to become a bishop. It was the terror of many Christian men who thought themselves unworthy for such high office, or perhaps just reacted with dismay at the onerous responsibilities that a bishop's life entailed. John and Basil were utterly horrified by this rumour about their own fate. So they entered into a pact with each other, either to be ordained as bishops together or not at all. John, however, despite his misgivings about himself, was convinced that Basil really would make a good bishop. So he resolved not to keep his side of the bargain. When an Orthodox press gang located and seized Basil and forcibly ordained him, John was nowhere to be found and refused to let the press gang get their hands on him. So John escaped his fate, breaking his pact with Basil. Basil was shattered by what he saw as his friend's duplicity. John, however, vigorously defended his conduct, arguing that by this prudent deception on his part, the church had gained an excellent bishop in the person of Basil, while losing nothing in not having so unsuitable a man as John. Most modern readers have found John's reasoning rather embarrassing here, as he defends the practice of prudent deception as necessary and useful, not only in war, but in medical practice, family life, and even relations between friends. Now, shortly after this hair's breadth escape from the Orthodox press gangs, John decided to flee the city of Antioch altogether and take refuge with the hermits on nearby Mount Silpios. There was much resentment in Antioch at his refusal to let himself be ordained, and he had other reasons for seeking seclusion among the hermits of Silpios. Chiefly, John found himself increasingly unable to control his sexual desires and felt that he must get away from feminine company entirely and learn from the holy hermits how to be a better, more self-disciplined Christian. It seems plausible that his mother Anthusa may have died by this juncture, so that he had no family tie to keep him in Antioch any longer. So in 372, John slipped away to Mount Silpios, where he put himself under the instruction of an experienced elder hermit, and set about subduing his rebellious flesh. He was to spend 6 years on Mount Silpios, years about which we unfortunately know next to nothing. In later life, however, John looked back with a glow of nostalgia to the time he spent among the hermits, where the whole aim and ideal of life was unbroken, undistracted, moment by moment fellowship with Christ. Protestants, of course, have not looked so favourably on this part of John's biography, owing to a suspicion about the value of monasticism. But even so, we should realise that these were the very early days of the monastic movement. At this stage, it was a novel experiment in godly living, an idealistic protest against the worldliness of the professing church. The hermits of Mount Silpios were not totally isolated, but lived in loosely organised communities, dividing their time between the worship of God, for example, learning the whole Bible by heart and the corporate singing of the Psalms, and manual labour, agriculture, weaving, the copying of books, no printing press in those days. John certainly seems to have found it an enriching experience. It's been argued that his time on Mount Silpios, in fact, had both a good and a bad effect on him. On the positive side, it gave John an atmosphere and a structure of life that developed in him profound spiritual and theological thoughts and meditations, which was soon to be the wellspring of his exceptional preaching and teaching. On the negative side, at this formative period of his early adulthood, it robbed John with familiarity with how men and women thought, felt and acted who were less spiritually minded than himself and the hermits. And that meant that afterwards, as a church leader, John would often act on the basis of a high and unworldly idealism which did not take into account the more earthy passions and prejudices that moved other people, even church leaders. During the final 2 years of his 6-year stay on Mount Silpios, John withdrew into a deeper seclusion, becoming much more of a real hermit. One of the distinctive features of Syrian monasticism was a belief that the highest spiritual perfection was found in the solitary life. John's motive seems to have been a desire for a less distracted, more intensely focused fellowship with God. During these 2 years of seclusion, he unfortunately practiced such a severe self-discipline, doing without any sleep at all, as far as possible, and eating the most scanty diet, that he permanently damaged his health. He was ever afterwards troubled by stomach problems, insomnia, and sudden rushes of blood to the head. After his ultimate return to a more public life in the church in Antioch, John must have rethought at least some of his earlier attitudes to the life of a hermit. He had this to say, no doubt born out of his own experience, perhaps especially of those last 2 years of seclusion on Silpios. Nothing more truly marks out the man who believes in Christ and loves him than that he is concerned for his brothers and sisters and exerts himself for their salvation. Let all the monks who have withdrawn to the mountain peaks and crucified themselves to the world heed these words. Let them back up the church's leaders with all the powers at their command, encouraging them by their prayers, their sympathy, their love. Let them realize that if, placed as they are so far away, they fail to sustain with all their efforts those whom God's grace has exposed to the anxieties and dangers of church leadership, their monastic life has lost all its point, and their religious devotion has been shown up as useless. Now, it was John's ill health that probably motivated his eventual abandonment of Mount Silpios and return to Antioch in the year 378. The Arian emperor Valens had died. and the imperial throne was now in the hands of his nephew Gratian, an Orthodox Christian. The exiled bishop of Antioch's Orthodox Christian community, Meletius, returned to his flock. Either at this point, or perhaps a bit later, the Orthodox were able to repossess the church buildings of Antioch, now that the imperial power was on their side. It was the turn of the Arians to be evicted and meet in the open air. John resumed his role as reader in the church. 2 years later, at the end of 380, Meletius ordained John to the diaconate. Now, it may be of interest to know what John's duties were as a deacon in a 4th century church. Some of his duties had to do with the service of worship. He would have recited the intercessory prayers, made sure the unbaptized left the building before the Lord's Supper, and also made sure that no unworthy person took part in the supper. Later on, when he was a presbyter and a preacher, John said to the deacons of his church, "If a general or a consul, or even he who wears the imperial crown, comes forward to the table unworthily, you must stop him. Your authority is greater than his." As a deacon, John wouldn't have been allowed to preach, but he would have assisted in the instruction of those preparing for baptism and taken part in the baptism itself. John's chief duties as a deacon, however, were in fact outside the service of worship. He and the other deacons were responsible for looking after the church's poor, the sick, widows, orphans, and Christians who were in prison. John himself tells us that the church in Antioch had to care for no fewer than 3,000 widows and unmarried women, economically unable to fend for themselves, in addition to the poor, the sick, and prisoners. So as a deacon, John was virtually a Christian social worker with a heavy workload. The normal pattern was that a church had 7 deacons modelled on Acts chapter 6, so there would have been 6 others sharing this arduous work with John. Somehow, John also found time to write, producing a stream of brilliant treatises, dealing, for example, with the superiority of Christianity to paganism, the deity of Christ, the nature and necessity of repentance, the celibate life, and the unseemliness of cohabitation. Now, that last treatise against cohabitation gives us an interesting view of Christian life in John's time. The treatise was directed against what was then the widespread practice of a Christian man and a Christian woman devoting themselves to lifelong celibacy but sharing the same house and caring for each other in a sort of purely spiritual partnership. The leaders of the churches had long frowned on this practice, and it appears that the church in Antioch had now decided to take action against it, using the eloquent John as their mouthpiece. John then argued vigorously against the custom of spiritual cohabitation. He said that it foolishly endangered chastity. The man and woman were exposing each other to temptation by living together in the same house. Moreover, such a manner of life inevitably gave rise to unedifying gossip. It had the appearance of evil, even if the man and woman succeeded in maintaining their personal purity. If a man devoted to celibacy needed a spiritual companion, said John, it would be better for him to share a house with another celibate man. And if a celibate woman could not live without a man's protection in the very masculine world of the Roman Empire, then it would be better for her to renounce her celibacy and marry. Anything rather than expose the gospel to scandal by an unmarried Christian man living with an unmarried Christian woman. Now, all of John's treatises would have been regarded as well-expressed models of Christian persuasion, and undoubtedly gave him a higher public profile, enhancing his reputation within the Christian community as a spiritual leader, even though he was as yet only a deacon. John's much-loved Bishop Meletius died shortly after John's ordination to the diaconate and was succeeded as bishop by Flavian. In 386, Flavian gave full recognition to his eloquent deacon's growing stature in the church by ordaining John as a presbyter or priest, The English word priest is in fact derived from the word presbyter, which of course means elder. This meant that John now had access to the pulpit, and so began his great career as a preacher, for which he's best remembered today. Perhaps this is the point at which to describe John's physical appearance. According to the records, he was a small man with a disproportionately big head, in a physical sense, that is, of course. His body was thin and gaunt. John himself said it was as frail as a spider's web. He had a longish nose, large ears, and piercing eyes. His spacious forehead was lined with furrows, and the top of his head had little hair, but he sported a rather untidy beard. Apparently, there was something pleasant in his natural expression, but he usually spoiled the effect by putting on an artificially severe look. Now, John was by no means the only presbyter in the Antioch church, but it was acknowledged that among the presbyters, preaching was John's supreme gift. And so John's Bishop Flavian set him free to a large extent from the other personal duties of a presbyter, so that John could concentrate his time and energies on the ministry of the pulpit. This was a challenging task. Although there were no Sunday evening services in the early church, John did not preach only on Sunday mornings, but also at special preaching services held regularly on Fridays and Saturdays, on the various festival days of the early church in honour of its martyrs and saints, and on many of the weekdays during the weeks leading up to and including Easter. So John had his hands full in preparing sermons. He also had a demanding audience. The city of Antioch was passionately addicted to sermons in a way that we would find difficult to comprehend. People would flock en masse to listen to a sermon. John often had to rebuke the great crowds for packing the church to listen to him preach, but then going home immediately afterwards, not staying to take part in the Lord's Supper, which John felt was wrong. Congregations were also much more lively and vocal in the 4th century than most are today. One particular custom was bursting into a round of applause and crying out, "13th Apostle," when a preacher said something especially eloquent. John once broke off his prepared sermon to reprimand his congregation with the utmost severity for this foolish practice. Unfortunately, his reprimand was so eloquent that they applauded him for it. Now, we know that John's sermons in Antioch were not written out, something that astonished his hearers. But when we think of how often he was preaching each week, we can appreciate that he probably simply didn't have the time to write out his sermons. Nevertheless, he prepared them carefully and thoroughly so that when he got into the pulpit, he wasn't trusting to the inspiration of the moment for his content. And even though John's sermons weren't written out before delivery, they were taken down by stenographers as he preached them, with a view to being published. And prior to publication, John almost always went over what the stenographers had written, and he polished it up to make it read better. John's method of preaching is what we would call expository. He took books of the Bible and preached his way through them, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, giving a running commentary, and seeking to draw forth moral and spiritual lessons for his congregation. His expositions followed the approach he'd learned from his old mentor, Diodor of Tarsus. So John avoided allegorization. He didn't quest after deep symbolic meanings in the text, but rather focused on the ordinary, straightforward meaning, seeking to explain it as clearly as he could, and then to apply it practically to his hearers. John preached various series of sermons in Antioch. So from the Old Testament, he covered the whole of Genesis, 58 selected Psalms, and Isaiah chapter 6. From the New Testament, Matthew's Gospel, 90 sermons, John's Gospel, 88 sermons, Romans, 32 sermons, 1 and 2 Corinthians, 44 sermons, Galatians, now we don't know how many sermons there, because the series was published not in sermon form, but as a commentary. Ephesians, 24 sermons, 1 and 2 Timothy, 28 sermons, and Titus, 6 sermons. The general consensus of later times is that these sermons of John are the most readable and the most accomplished collection of Bible expositions from the entire period of the early church, say the first 500 years. One historical point worth making is that, strictly speaking, John did not in fact preach from a pulpit in the modern sense. He preached from a smaller lectern-like structure known as an ambo, and he preached sitting down. In the early church, the preacher sat to preach, the congregation stood to listen. The usual place for preaching was a chair behind the Lord's table, but John preferred to be nearer to the congregation, so he preached from the ambo where the scripture readings were recited. This was in much closer proximity to the people. One reason for John choosing to preach from the ambo was that he didn't have a particularly powerful voice. Another was simply a desire to establish as intimate a rapport with his listeners as he could, which was easier if he was physically nearer them. So when we imagine John preaching, we shouldn't think of him standing in a pulpit elevated over the people, but sitting in a chair behind an ambo level with his hearers. We know that John's contemporaries gloried in his preaching, and that, of course, is why he eventually acquired the nickname Chrysostom, golden mouth. It was said that people were so entranced by John's oratory that they lost all awareness of their surroundings, which enabled pickpockets to carry out a thriving trade. J.N.D. Kelly, in his biography, says, "The crowds which hung on his lips were magnetized by the conviction and passion which pulsated through every paragraph of John's sermons." As for the spiritual content and force of his preaching, F.W. Farrer has commented that the inhabitants of Antioch heard a call to repentance more powerful than had been heard since the death of the apostles. C.H. Spurgeon put it like this. He quotes Matthew 11:12, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force." And then Spurgeon says this, "Every era of the church's prosperity has been marked by this same holy violence. Hear Chrysostom speak. He is no player upon a goodly instrument. He gives forth no dulcet tones for gentle ears. Hear how he denounces the sins of the times, how vehemently he calls upon men to escape for their lives because of coming judgment." If we were to pick out one dominant note in John's preaching, perhaps it was a rousing call to Christians to live worthy of their salvation by following Christ wholeheartedly in every aspect of life and refusing all compromise with the world. To understand John's fiery insistence on this, we need to appreciate the nature of his audience. The conversion of the emperors to Christianity had made Christianity fashionable, and the faith of many of John's hearers in Antioch was a rather half-baked affair. Baptized church members were often semi-pagan in their manner of life. They would think nothing of leaving church and going straight to the horse races or to the theatre to watch the latest piece of sexual decadence offered up in the name of entertainment. They believed in ridiculous omens. They wore amulets and charms. They consulted books of magic. They swore rash oaths at the drop of a hat. They made Christmas and New Year an excuse for gross intemperance in eating and drinking. They snobbishly treated slaves like dirt. John burned with holy fire at the ambo, denouncing all such conduct explicitly, thunderously, and unceasingly, and holding up as in a crystal clear mirror the nature and standards of true Christian discipleship. No one could listen to John's outspoken preaching comfortably unless they were prepared to change the way they lived. John became especially famous or notorious for criticizing affluent Christians. He complained vehemently that despite the great wealth of some church members, the church itself could not afford to discharge its sacred duties, so tight-fisted were the better off in their giving. Consequently, the clergy themselves had to get involved in business to raise the necessary finances for church work, to the detriment of their pastoral and spiritual duties. John poured utter contempt on the sumptuous mansions of wealthy believers, with their gold, marble, and exotic carpets, their beautifully dressed eunuch slaves, waiting on every whim of their masters and mistresses, their lush banquets of the most costly meats, pastries, and wines. How, John asked, was this luxurious self-indulgence consistent with having their hearts and treasures in heaven? Now, in this connection, John reserved his severest rebukes for well-off Christian ladies who came to church flaunting extravagant hairstyles, decked out in gold and pearls and expensive dresses, looking, he said, more like glamorous actresses or high-class prostitutes than chaste and modest brides of Christ. All they succeeded in doing, John informed them pointedly, was to make themselves the laughingstock of pagans, who pointed them out as proof that Christians were just a bunch of phonies who merely talked the talk but did not walk the walk. John certainly succeeded in creating extremes of reaction to himself and his preaching among the ladies of the church. He would find his most fervent followers and his most bitter enemies among Christian women. Not that John cared in the slightest. He had a most sublime indifference to whether people loved him or hated him. And certainly a good number of the wealthy did resent his plain speaking. "Will you never stop sharpening your tongue against the well-off?" they protested, so John himself tells us. And the answer was, no, he would not. Partly because there was little in the way of a welfare state in those days, so that if the rich did not help the poor would probably just starve and die. To awaken the consciences of the prosperous Christians of Antioch, therefore, John set before them in vivid colours the plight of the poor. While well-to-do believers wallowed in their affluence, he said, Antioch overflowed with the poor, the destitute, the homeless. Behold the beggars who live on beds of straw in the open air, frozen stiff with cold and tormented with hunger. Behold the unvisited prisoners in their filthy cells, chained up, starving, scarred, and bleeding from being scourged. Are these not human beings made in God's image? John asked. Will God take no account of your neglect of them? As a deacon, John had often relieved the beggar and visited the prisoner. He saw no reason why affluent Christians should palm all that off onto the deacons, while they themselves lived it up like princes and princesses. As for you, he cried out, you would give your children in exchange for your circus charioteers. You would throw away your very souls for your pantomime dancers. Yet when Christ is starving, you would not hand over the smallest piece of money. If you do give a few pence, it's as if you've given away your entire fortune. But when we have to give an account of ourselves and we hear Christ saying, you saw me hungry and gave me nothing to eat, naked and you did not clothe me, what shall we say? And what shall we plead in our defence? Now, it's no wonder that the mass of the common people loved John. They saw in him their spokesman, their champion, their tribune, their sympathetic brother who understood them. Very rarely has a prominent preacher so forcefully and so often reminded prosperous Christians of their social conscience, and so fully won the allegiance of the common man. Historians, indeed, have often called John almost a socialist in the pulpit. But we should moderate that judgment with two qualifications. First, John never exhorted the government to meet the needs of the poor and the destitute. He saw this as the role of private charity. And second, he was equally passionate in reminding all Christians of whatever rank of their duty to take discipleship resolutely into the hands-on details of ordinary life, eating, drinking, dressing, entertainment, the wallet, practical trust in God, practical charity to others. Now, in case we think John had a limited repertoire and never preached anything but the moral obligations of the affluent, or the responsibility of Christians to refuse conformity with the world, let's listen for a moment to John proclaiming the death of Christ from 2 Corinthians 5:21. What has God done? Him that knew no sin, he made to be sin for you. For if he had achieved nothing else but done only this, think how great a thing it is to give his Son for those that had outraged him. But now he has truly achieved mighty things, and besides has allowed him that did no wrong to be punished for those who had done wrong. Yet Paul did not say this, but mentioned that which is far greater than this. What then is this? Him that knew no sin, he says, him that was righteousness itself, he made sin. That is, allowed him to be condemned as a sinner, as one cursed to die. For cursed is he that hangs on a tree. For to die like this was far greater than simply to die. And this he also elsewhere implies, saying, becoming obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. For this thing carried with it not only punishment, but also disgrace. Reflect, therefore, what great things he bestowed on you. For it would indeed be a great thing for even a sinner to die for anyone whatever. But when he who undergoes this is righteous, and yet dies for sinners, and not only dies, but even dies as one cursed, and not as cursed only, but thereby freely bestows upon us those great benefits which we never anticipated. For he says that we might become the righteousness of God in him. What words, what thought shall be adequate to realize these things? For the righteous one he made a sinner, he says, that he might make the sinners righteous. Indeed, rather he didn't even say this, but what was greater by far. For the word he employed is not the practice, sinner, but the quality itself, sin. For he did not say made him a sinner, but made him sin. Not only him that had not sinned, but that had not even known sin, so that we also might become, he did not say righteous, but righteousness. Indeed, the righteousness of God. For this is the righteousness of God, when we are justified not by works, in which case it would be necessary that not even a spot should be found, but by grace, in which case all sin is done away. And this, at the same time that it doesn't allow us to be lifted up, for it is entirely the free gift of God, teaches us also the greatness of what is given. For what came before was a righteousness of the law and of works, but this is the righteousness of God. Well, there's John, the evangelical preacher. With careful expository preaching then and fervent practical exhortation, John's golden voice rang out from the ambo of Antioch for 12 years. He soon became the most celebrated and admired preacher in the Greek-speaking half of the Roman Empire, the Spurgeon or the Lloyd-Jones of his day. The consequences of this fame were fateful for John, as we shall see. Let's just mention some of John's other activities during this Antioch period. He continued to write. In addition to his published sermons, he composed a number of treatises, the most famous of which was On the Priesthood, an exposition of the nature and duties of a Christian pastor. This has been reprinted and translated into other languages more often than any of John's other works. Another early church father, Isidore of Pelusium, said of this treatise, "No one can read this volume without feeling his heart inflamed with the love of God. It sets forth how worthy of reverence and how difficult is the office of the priesthood, and it shows how to fulfill it as it ought to be fulfilled." Another interesting production of John's pen at this time was a treatise on how to raise children, often since the 17th century known as St. John Chrysostom's Golden Booklet on Bringing Up Children. This is the first known attempt by a Christian writer to set out a comprehensive program for the education of the young. John makes a distinction between intellectual and moral training. He seems happy to leave the intellectual aspect to the traditional school system, which he himself had experienced. But he insists that training the moral character is at least as important as training the intellect, and that the home is the proper sphere for moral education. It is the duty of the parents to form the moral values and character of their children. The task cannot be delegated to anyone else. John highlights the importance of teaching the Bible to children and instilling into them the precepts of Christian morality. He advocates that boys should be married young to preserve their chastity. John thought, perhaps from his own experience, that sexual temptation was the besetting problem for growing boys, and that marriage was God's remedy. So that parents must do all they can to keep temptation away from boys and get them married as soon as possible. He doesn't have so much to say about the upbringing of girls, but he is sure that their besetting temptation is vanity about clothes and jewellery. Parents must not indulge this vanity, but teach girls to value higher things. We should also mention the greatest public affair that John became involved in during his 12 years at Antioch. This was the affair of the statues in the year 387. That's only 1 year following John's ordination as a presbyter. Shortly before Easter that year, a new tax provoked a popular riot in Antioch. A wild mob attacked the city governor's house, destroyed many paintings and statues of the emperor Theodosius and his wife, and his family, amid cries of obscene hostility, and almost succeeded in setting fire to the whole city. After the local authorities had restored order, Antioch trembled in fear of what the emperor would do. A fortnight later, imperial commissioners arrived in the city, and within days had announced their decision. Antioch was to be stripped of its rank as the capital of Syria, strict martial law imposed on the city for the foreseeable future, the distribution of bread to the poor stopped, and the entire body of city councillors either banished or executed for failing to maintain order. Over the next few weeks, there was a race to reach the Emperor Theodosius in Constantinople, 800 miles away. As the head of the Imperial Commission returned with his verdict for the emperor to ratify, while Bishop Flavian rushed to get there ahead of the commissioner to plead for mercy. Now, Theodosius was a very devout and sincere Christian, so the chances were good that he would listen to Flavian if only the bishop could get there first. During the anxious weeks of waiting, John preached a series of 21 sermons to a packed church, exhorting, rebuking, comforting, and seeking to bring the light of Scripture to bear on the atmosphere of doom and dread that had gripped the whole city. Pagans, too, flocked to listen to John's words of moral and spiritual counsel as he endeavoured to lift hearts and minds above all earthly scenes to God and to a serene and courageous trust in him. At length, the news arrived. Bishop Flavian had got to Constantinople first, and Emperor Theodosius had yielded to his pleas for clemency. All penalties were cancelled. Mercy had triumphed gloriously over wrath. The city of Antioch went wild with joy. The pagans of Antioch were deeply impressed by what had happened. A Christian bishop had successfully persuaded a Christian emperor to show mercy in the name of Christ. A Christian preacher, John, had calmed, comforted, and counselled the panic-stricken city throughout the crisis with words of the most noble and exalted eloquence. So it wasn't surprising that in the aftermath of this affair, John and his bishop found themselves having to prepare for baptism an unprecedented number of pagans who now professed themselves won over to Christianity. The light of the Christians had shone before men, and the pagans had seen their good works and were giving glory to Christ. By the year 398, there was no preacher in the eastern Greek-speaking half of the empire more celebrated than John in Antioch. But that forms a junction to the next part of the talk, so I think maybe we'll have our 10-minute comfort break at that point. So time for a comfort break. Okay. Now, as I said, by the year 398, there was no preacher in the eastern Greek-speaking half of the empire more celebrated than John in Antioch. Now that year, Nectarius, the bishop of Constantinople, the capital city, died. The new emperor Arcadius, son of Theodosius, who died 3 years previously, needed a new bishop for his imperial capital. The struggle within the church between different factions in Constantinople to get their candidate elected as Nectarius' successor was fierce, highly politicized, and simmering with plots, conspiracy, and intrigue. However, the emperor, advised by his chief minister, the eunuch Eutropius, already had his eye on John. Eutropius had heard John preach in Antioch. His golden-mouthed eloquence had convinced Eutropius that this was the man who would bring glory to the church of the eastern capital, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, as it was called. To prevent the citizens of Antioch raising a riotous protest against the loss of their favourite preacher, Emperor Arcadius sent troops to Antioch. The governor of the city then invited the unsuspecting John to visit a chapel with him outside the city walls, and there the imperial troops virtually kidnapped him and escorted him to Constantinople. John protested, but as Eutropius had forecast, the people of Constantinople were overjoyed at the thought of having the East's most famous preacher as their bishop. John submitted and was ordained to his new office. Arcadius' actions in securing John as Bishop of Constantinople shows how the Christian emperors of the East had started behaving as virtual heads of the church. Arcadius had reduced the role of the people in choosing their new bishop to merely assenting to his own imperial choice. Well, John proved as popular a preacher in Constantinople as he had been in Antioch. The mass of ordinary people in the imperial capital became passionately attached to him. On one Sunday, when John unexpectedly did not preach, but invited a visiting bishop from Galatia to take his place, the vast congregation streamed out of the church in protest. They wanted to hear John and would put up with no substitutes. As he had in Antioch, John preached a series of expository sermons which have survived in written form. So Acts of the Apostles, 55 sermons, Philippians, 15 sermons, Colossians, 5 sermons, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 16 sermons, Philemon, 3 sermons, Hebrews, 34 sermons. There were also many sermons for the festival days of the church, sermons prompted by personal or political circumstances, and a new type of sermon, the official sermon on a state occasion, when the imperial court were among his audience. Once again, John did not shirk from pressing home on the affluent worshippers of Constantinople their social obligations to the poor. And once again, this made him some enemies among the wealthy who did not like what they were hearing. They were especially outraged by something John said in his exposition of Colossians, when he criticised rich Christian ladies who had their toilet utensils made from solid silver, as though their excrement deserved special treatment, while all around them their poverty-stricken sisters and brothers in Christ were scantily dressed and shivering in the cold of Constantinople. John apologised a few days later for using such crude language in a sermon, but no doubt he was upset that people could be more scandalised by his blunt speaking than they were by the appalling plight of the poor. Such utterances from the ambo, however, only endeared John to the common people. Here was a true bishop, they felt, who loved them and understood their lives. John was something of a reformer as Bishop of Constantinople. The first thing he did was overhaul the finances of his new church, putting an end to the lavish banquets his predecessor had habitually thrown. The result was a substantial saving in money, which John devoted to caring for the destitute. There was already a Christian hospital attached to the church, and John channeled new funds into it, as well as building several new hospitals. He also founded a special hospital for lepers outside the city walls near the river Lysos. There were also numerous Christian-operated houses for the poor and homeless in Constantinople, and as bishop, John was in charge of these too, and supported them to the limit of his resources. John showed himself committed to evangelism, as well as caring for the church's poor. In addition to his own sermons in the Church of the Holy Wisdom, which often had an evangelistic element, he also directed efforts at evangelizing the pagan peasants of Thrace, the province of the empire where Constantinople was situated. In particular, he encouraged wealthy property owners to build churches in the countryside, rather than shopping centres, baths and taverns. John also focused a special endeavour on evangelising the Germanic barbarian tribe of the Goths, many of whom had settled in Constantinople. Now, the Goths were Arians, Christian in a sense, but not believing in the deity of Christ. John gave them a church for their own use, on condition that it be staffed by Orthodox Trinitarian clergy, and he made sure that the clergy learned and used the Gothic language. Sometimes John himself preached in the Gothic church, in Greek with an interpreter. We're told that these missionary efforts among the Goths of Constantinople resulted in the conversion of many from Arianism to the Orthodox Trinitarian faith. We should also glance at how John introduced new religious events into the worship life of Constantinople. Let me briefly mention two elements of his innovations here. First of all, he introduced special nighttime services. These had been in vogue in Antioch, and John transplanted them into the imperial capital. They involved gathering to worship God during the nocturnal hours, sometimes throughout the whole night, and at least partly, it seems, in the open air. John waxed eloquent on the spiritual benefits of worshipping in the period of darkness and silence, when the mind is raised up to the awesome glory of the Creator by contemplating the 10,000 stars that spangle the night sky. And then second, John introduced religious processions in which hymns were sung proclaiming the deity of Christ. Now, these processions were John's response to similar acts of worship by the Arians of Constantinople. They would process through the city singing blasphemous hymns that denied Christ's deity. John got his congregation to adopt the practice, but in the service of Trinitarian orthodoxy. Once, we're told, the two processions, Orthodox and Arian, clashed, resulting in a bloody street battle with casualties on both sides. The people of Constantinople obviously got very worked up about religion. One of the most important aspects of John's new life as Bishop of Constantinople was the new personal relationships he made there, which were to influence him deeply. And we can look at two in particular. First of all, attached to the Church of the Holy Wisdom was a special dwelling for Christian ladies who had decided to devote themselves to the single life. This was by no means an easy thing socially and economically in the culture of the Roman Empire. As we've seen, it was one reason why a celibate Christian woman might put herself under the protection of a celibate Christian man in a spiritual partnership, something John did not approve of. Another option was for single women to club together, as it were, as a sort of spiritual sisterhood and support each other. Such a sisterhood existed in Constantinople, its abode next to John's church. There were some 250 single Christian ladies in residence, and they were presided over by a quite remarkable woman named Olympias. Now, Olympias was from a stupendously wealthy aristocratic family. But when her husband died after only 2 years of marriage, Olympias interpreted this as a call from God to the single life, and thereupon devoted herself entirely to the care of the poor and the sick, using her wealth to that end. The members of her sisterhood carried out this caring work as well as offering hospitality to travellers. In her early 30s, when John arrived in Constantinople, Olympias was a beautiful, highly intelligent, highly educated young woman with a passionate love of the Bible, which she read through over and over again, and a strong-minded character. John's predecessor, Bishop Nectarius, had ordained her as a deaconess. Female deacons were a settled feature of life in the early church, with the responsibility of caring specifically for Christian women. Now, when John became bishop, he and Olympias, bishop and deaconess, of course, got to know each other, and a profound friendship quickly sprang up between them. They had close affinities both intellectually and spiritually. Olympias became utterly devoted to John, taking care of his clothing and his meals. John was the only man allowed to enter the dwelling of the sisterhood, where as their bishop he would preach to the sisters. His inspired sermons, we're told, set their hearts ablaze with love for God. Here then was a new positive relationship in John's life, which would endure to his death. J.N.D. Kelly in his biography says, "There was no one in Constantinople with whom John was to have a deeper or more sympathetic understanding, no one with whom he was to feel more at ease, or to whom he was to pour out his heart more unreservedly, than this independent, strong-willed, but also intensely emotional woman." Let's be clear that there was never any hint of the slightest impropriety in their relationship. The bishop and the deaconess did not and would not, on principle, spend any time alone in each other's company. And they always addressed each other with an elaborate formality and courtesy. The friendship from beginning to end was purely platonic, a meeting of minds alone, never of bodies. Nevertheless, their mutual attachment was deep, affectionate, and lasting. There would never be anyone quite like Olympias in John's life. And in Olympias' life, there would never be anyone quite like John. The second new relationship in Constantinople was with the imperial family, the Emperor Arcadius and the Empress Eudoxia. Arcadius was only about 20 years old. Of slender build and stammering voice, he was a rather ineffectual personality, easily dominated by others. The one who dominated him was his wife, Eudoxia. She was a stunningly beautiful woman, a member of the Frankish tribe that had given its name to the land of France. Intelligent, spirited, and strong-willed, Eudoxia was also ambitious and much given to political intrigue. She ruled her husband with the aid of an inner circle of ladies of the court. Her religion had in it a powerful strain of superstition, which was to show itself in John's favour, as we shall see. Normally, Arcadius and Eudoxia worshipped in their private chapel, but on special occasions they joined the crowds to hear John preach in the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Now, at first, Arcadius and Eudoxia welcomed John as their new bishop and supported him. They were glad to see the church of the imperial capital made glorious by the presence of the East's greatest preacher. But things very shortly turned sour. The fact is that John's personality just did not fit into the corrupt and complex political world of the Eastern capital and its royal court. John was an intense, unworldly man who had neither taste nor talent for politics or intrigue. Nor did he change or tone down his preaching from the hard-hitting style that had marked his ministry in Antioch. The great ladies of the court who surrounded Eudoxia were the first to turn against their new bishop. They did not take kindly to his uncompromising stance on how the affluent should conduct themselves, and they especially reacted against his forthright pulpit comments on Christian women who entered church looking more like tarted-up hussies come to display their plumage than chaste handmaids of Christ come to adore the thrice-holy God. The cronies of the empress having thus conceived a toxic enmity for John, it wasn't long before they poisoned Eudoxia's own mind against him, although she was held in check for a while by her superstitious awe of the great preacher. But once Eudoxia herself had begun to turn against John, he could expect little help from the emperor, who was totally under his wife's thumb. What seems to have sealed John's fate with Eudoxia was a sermon he preached in the year 401, in which he expounded the story of Naboth's vineyard from 1 Kings 21, vigorously denouncing Jezebel for her pivotal role in the seizure of the vineyard. Now it happens that Eudoxia had just engaged in a similar piece of unscrupulous behaviour, seizing the vineyard of a poor widow. John spoke of Jezebel's sin in such a way that most people were sure he was really referring to Eudoxia, seeking to use the biblical story to arouse the conscience of the empress. All he aroused was her wrath. But the dislike of Eudoxia and her circle of court ladies could not by itself have ruined John. They could work against him only through factions in the church. Unfortunately, a powerful anti-John faction did indeed develop, among the Eastern clergy and monks. Mostly this was because, after being installed in Constantinople, John used the full weight of his authority as bishop to try to compel the clerics and monastics of the imperial city and the whole surrounding region of Asia Minor to live up to his own high ideals of Christian life and ministry. Many of them were simply unwilling to do this. John therefore made bitter enemies by his reforming zeal. For instance, soon after taking up his new position, John carried out a drastic purge of the clergy of Constantinople, sacking a number, including 2 of his deacons, who it seems had been found guilty of sexual sin and murder. This white-hot moral fervour of John was a shocking, electrifying contrast to the easygoing ways of his predecessor, Bishop Nectarius. If it won John the devotion of some like-minded friends like Olympius, it earned for him much more the hostility of many foes, men who were not prepared to tolerate such a dedicated reformer as their bishop. 2 enemies John made in particular were Constantinople's foremost monk, Abbot Isaac, and Bishop Severian of Gabala. Isaac was described by one of John's closest disciples, Palladius, as Isaac the little Syrian, the layabout, troop leader of bogus monks, who has worn himself out with his incessant slander of bishops. Isaac had more or less been running the monasteries of Constantinople as a private fiefdom, a law unto himself. Once John made it clear that from now on Abbot Isaac was under the authority of his bishop, Isaac became John's deadly enemy. As for Bishop Severian of Gabala, he was, like John, from Syria, a good preacher, whom John had welcomed in Constantinople, introduced to the royal court, and when John was away, given his own pulpit or ambo to preach from. However, when John arrived back in Constantinople from a lengthy spiritual visitation of the western coast of Asia Minor, his deacon Serapion informed him that in his absence, Severian, who'd been filling in for John, had shamefully misused his position to try to undermine John's authority and promote himself. He'd become a favourite with Eudoxia. John, who placed great confidence in Deacon Serapion, acted swiftly and ordered Severian to leave Constantinople. Eudoxia intervened, ordering Severian's immediate return. Things became very ugly, with the mass of ordinary people taking John's side. A patched-up reconciliation was ultimately contrived, but from that point onwards, Severian hated John and was at the heart of all intrigue to topple him. But John's deadliest foe was not in Constantinople at all. This was Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria. Now, Alexandria had been the most important church in the East, the home of the great Athanasius. But in recent times, Constantinople had begun to outshine Alexandria. After all, Constantinople was the imperial capital, and now with such a famous preacher as John as its bishop, Constantinople had thrown Alexandria quite into the shade. Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria resented this deeply, and he was determined to do anything he could to destroy the position of Constantinople's bishop. Theophilus also had personal reasons for disliking John, since John had given hospitality to 4 Egyptian monks known from their height as the Tall Brothers, whom Theophilus had condemned. The controversy over the Tall Brothers is too complicated for us to enter into. Suffice it to say that it kindled malevolent passions and did more than anything else to inflame Theophilus against John. Theophilus, by the way, must be one of the most unattractive characters in early church history. F.W. Farrer calls him the detestable Theophilus. His only virtue seems to have been a dazzling talent for scheming against his enemies and flattering and bribing others to take his side. By 403, John had stirred up so many adversaries, both in the court and among the clergy and monks, that Theophilus saw his moment to strike had arrived. He left Alexandria and travelled in person up to Asia Minor to complain about John's treatment of the Tall Brothers. He made it clear that he was on his way to the court to depose John. Theophilus had laid his plans with great thoroughness. He sent ahead of him a whole squadron of Egyptian bishops to act as his bloodhounds. He journeyed by land, not by sea, so that he could visit as many churches as possible, using every trick to mobilize the clergy against John. Once Theophilus arrived in Constantinople, he took up residence in a palace owned by Eudoxia and spent the next 3 weeks vigorously lobbying anyone who had a grievance against John, including Abbot Isaac, the troop leader of Constantinople's monks, and the embittered Severian of Gabala, who were both fully involved in the plot. At length, in September 403, Theophilus convened a council of bishops in the city of Chalcedon, not far from Constantinople. The council was presided over by a one-time confidant of John's, Bishop Paul of Heraclea, who had now turned against his old friend. 29 accusations against John were submitted by the 2 deacons he had deposed on his first arrival in Constantinople, and a further 17 accusations were brought by Abbot Isaac. Some of these allegations were patently absurd to anyone who knew John, such as love of money, gluttony, sexual impropriety with women, even punching his enemies in the mouth during Holy Communion. Other charges were based on intense personal rivalries, where John's words and actions were no doubt given the worst possible spin, such as the claim that he had called one of his critics a babbler and a little weirdo. Several times the council summoned John to appear, but he refused. He did not acknowledge the council's legality. At length, Theophilus and his accomplices pronounced John guilty, declared him to be deposed, and informed the court and the people of Constantinople of their decision. In informing the court, they added a further allegation that John had insulted the empress by calling her Jezebel. The Emperor Arcadius immediately confirmed the council's verdict. This was the ideal opportunity for the court to get rid of the troublesome bishop. Soldiers were dispatched to arrest John. But the ordinary people of Constantinople were passionately devoted to him, and they rose in protest, surrounding the Church of the Holy Wisdom by day and by night, preventing the soldiers from getting anywhere near their beloved bishop. John, however, decided that he couldn't endanger the lives of his people or the tranquility of the city by resisting the emperor. So a few days later, he secretly slipped out of the church and surrendered to the authorities. They bundled him onto a ship, and it sailed away to the market town of Praenitus on the southern coast of the Black Sea. However, within days, before the ship could get any further, Arcadius and Eudoxia did a remarkable about-face, cancelled John's banishment, and recalled him. This was as a result of some disaster that struck the capital. Some sources say it was an earthquake. Others, that Eudoxia, who was pregnant, gave birth to her child stillborn. Whatever the nature of the calamity, Eudoxia seems to have been terrified that this was God's judgment on her for having exiled John. So the troops were ordered to bring him back. John re-entered Constantinople in triumph, the people thronging the streets in their myriads and cheering. The bishop had won his first contest with the emperor and empress. Theophilus of Alexandria, his scheming in ruins, slunk back to Egypt, complaining that the people of Constantinople had been so enraged against him that he was in fear of his life. But John's victory was not to last. Just a few months later, in November 403, Eudoxia had a silver statue of herself set up near the Church of the Holy Wisdom, and the wild games and festivities around the statue disturbed the services of worship. John broke off from his prepared sermon to express his strong disapproval of the ungodly tumult and to condemn those who had organized it. A report of John's utterances was sent to the court. Eudoxia was once again enraged against John and again began scheming for his downfall. The breach of relationships between John and the imperial couple was so deep that they refused to receive Holy Communion at his hands in the special Christmas service that year. Theophilus of Alexandria scented his chance to intervene again, So he wrote to Arcadius and Eudoxia, dredging up an old ruling by a council held in Antioch 60 years previously, which stated that a bishop deposed by a council could not resume his responsibilities without first being exonerated by another council. John had resumed his responsibilities in defiance of this ruling. Therefore, he had no right to act as bishop and must be summarily removed from office. Theophilus' argument carefully ignored the fact that his council at Chalcedon that had deposed John had itself possessed no validity in church law, and that its sentence had not been carried out by the church, but by the government. The imperial couple, however, seized on Theophilus' argument as a pretext for ridding themselves once again of John. First, Arcadius had John put under house arrest. But Easter was fast approaching, the time in the early church calendar when all new converts, catechumens as they were called, were baptized en masse. John, the clergy loyal to him, and the great body of his people decided that the baptisms should go ahead, despite John's absence. The clergy hostile to John persuaded the authorities to put a stop to these proceedings. They were determined not to let John's church function in his absence. So, as Saturday evening fell and the baptismal service began, a detachment of 400 soldiers broke into the church. J.N.D. Kelly describes what happened. There followed extraordinary scenes of brutality and sacrilege, with officiating clergy being driven out with cudgels, women catechumens who had undressed in preparation for immersion fleeing half naked, the water in the fonts turned red with the blood of the wounded. The next day, Easter Sunday, the desecrated church stood deserted. The congregation had gathered instead in the public baths. But once again, the imperial stormtroopers attacked them and drove them out. Some of the clergy and even more lay people were thrown in prison. John himself remained under house arrest for a further 2 months, during which at least one attempt was made to assassinate him, not by the emperor or empress, but almost unbelievably by his clerical enemies. The government seems to have been paralysed over this period, shaken to the core by the mass popular support for John. Eventually, however, John's foes among the clergy persuaded Arcadius to send him away into exile again. Now, John could easily have raised the mob against the emperor, but he meekly submitted to the injustice. There was an emotional farewell in the Church of the Holy Wisdom between John and his committed followers among the bishops, presbyters and deacons, and a more private parting in the baptistry between himself and faithful Olympius and 3 other deaconesses. Then the soldiers escorted him to a ship and to his second exile. The ship took John once again along the southern coast of the Black Sea, at length to Armenia, where he was to remain under constant military guard for 3 years, dragged about from one city, town or village to another. He kept in touch with his supporters in Constantinople by letter, especially with Olympius. 17 of his letters to her have survived, and they're generally regarded as being the most fascinating items from John's exile. J.N.D. Kelly says, "The letters reveal with a vividness which has few parallels in ancient correspondence the intimacy and deep mutual trust which bound together these 2 remarkable spirits. Their close rapport is evident in the naturalness with which John pours out all the minute incidents of his daily life, the ups and downs of his health, his reaction to the cruel Armenian winter. It comes out again in his eagerness to hear from her, in his restless interest in her health, in the desolation he feels when letters fail to arrive from her." Let me give you a quotation. Here's John comforting Olympius. "Even when I look at these calamities, I do not abandon the hope of better things, considering as I do who the pilot is in all this. Not one who gets the better of the storm by his art, but calms the raging waters by his rod. But if he does not accomplish this at the outset and speedily, such is his custom. He does not at the beginning put down these terrible evils, but when they've increased and come to extremities and most persons are reduced to despair, then he works wondrously and beyond all expectation. thus manifesting his own power and training the patience of those who undergo these calamities. Do not, therefore, be cast down. For there is only one thing, Olympius, which is really terrible, only one real trial, and that is sin. And I've never ceased continually harping upon this theme. But as for all other things, plots, enmities, frauds, calumnies, insults, accusations, confiscation, exile, the keen sword of the enemy, the peril of the deep, warfare of the whole world, or anything else you like to name, they are but idle tales. Do you see the abundance of resource belonging to God, his wisdom, his extraordinary power, his loving kindness and care? Do not therefore be dismayed or troubled, but continue to give thanks to God for all things, praising and invoking him, beseeching and supplicating. Even if countless tumults and troubles come upon you, even if tempests are stirred up before your eyes, let none of these things disturb you. For our Master is not baffled by the difficulty, even if all things are reduced to the extremity of ruin. It is possible for him to raise those who have fallen, to convert those who are in error, to set straight those who have been ensnared, to release those who have been laden with countless sins and make them righteous, to quicken the dead, to restore lustre to decayed things and freshness to those which have waxed old. Olympius needed such words of encouragement because the situation in Constantinople was grim during John's exile. A new bishop for the Church of the Holy Wisdom had been appointed, but the majority would have nothing to do with him, remaining loyal to John and meeting in the open air for worship. Many of John's supporters were subjected to brutal government persecution, including Olympius, who was punished with a crippling fine when she steadfastly refused to acknowledge the new bishop. John was her bishop, whether in Constantinople or in exile. The divisions in the church spread far beyond the capital city, with clergy and people lining up either behind John or behind his opponents, splitting many a congregation. These divisions were not to be fully healed for another 30 years. Early in the year 407, Arcadius and Eudoxia decided to intensify the misery of John's exile by deporting him to the remote, inhospitable fortress town of Pictius, on the furthest eastern extremity of the empire. The military escort was instructed to show no regard for John's well-being. So he was forced to march the great distance on foot, and was deliberately exposed to a deadly combination of scorching sun and lashing rain. After 3 weeks of this treatment, John collapsed, still some way from Pictius, at a hamlet called Bizeri. Racked with fever, his skin baked as red as a brick, John died within hours of his collapse, aged 58. His last words were, "Glory be to God for all things." 31 years later, in 438, the Emperor Theodosius II, son of Arcadius and Eudoxia, brought John's remains back to Constantinople. He publicly begged forgiveness for the terrible sin of his parents and had the saint's bones buried in the imperial capital in the Church of the Holy Apostles, now the traditional burial place for bishops and emperors. The whole city turned out to celebrate the vindication of their beloved bishop's memory. The tables had turned conclusively. No one could now be found to vilify John. The homecoming of his bones ended the divisions in the churches of the East. And from that time to the present day, the universal church has recognized John as one of its most luminous stars, a bishop of pure character and steely integrity, a patient martyr for his Lord, a biblical preacher never surpassed in holy eloquence, John of the golden mouth. F.W. Farrer calls him one of the noblest, wisest, and most eloquent of the fathers. If John had a fault, it was lack of tact. He could be painfully and perhaps needlessly blunt in calling a sin. But that was surely a small spot in a bright and a gallant sun. John may not have been a great theologian like Athanasius or Augustine. He didn't sway the destiny of nations or cultures as Luther and Calvin were to do. But as a servant of Christ, who both eloquently preached and intensely lived practical Christianity, and won the passionate affection and loyalty of the common man, John Chrysostom has had very few equals. Let's allow C.H. Spurgeon to have the last word. Hath it not been told you concerning Chrysostom the golden-mouthed, how whenever he preached, the church was thronged with attentive hearers, and there, standing and lifting up holy hands, he spake with a majesty unparalleled the word of God, in truth and righteousness, the people listening, hanging forward to catch every word, and anon breaking the silence with the clapping of their hands and the stamping of their feet. Then silent again for a while, spellbound by the mighty orator, and again carried away with enthusiasm, springing to their feet, clapping their hands, and shouting for joy again. Numberless were the conversions in his day. God was exceedingly magnified, for sinners were abundantly saved.